Hello and welcome to Criminal Record, the Daily Record's weekly crime show. My name is Billy Gaddy and I'm joined by someone you'll know very well, Norman Silvester. He will take us through the big crime stories covered by Record in the past few days. Norman, welcome to Criminal Record.
Thank you, Billy.
Well, we'll just get started. It's been a busy period for the Record, so let's get right into it. Police Scotland came under fire last week for not taking enough fingerprints of suspects. Can you tell us more about that, Norman?
Yeah, this is an interesting story, Billy. We ran it last week. A report by the Scottish Biometrics Commission, a guy called Brian Plaistow, they discovered that in the last 12 months or last year, the Police Scotland had failed to take more than 12,000 fingerprints of suspects. And basically he's saying they're not taking enough fingerprints and they're not taking enough photographs of suspects. So that's an unusual one because police often get accused of holding too much data, too much information. Now, under Scots law, the police can take your fingerprints and photograph after you've been arrested. But the Biometrics Commissioner, Dr. Plaistow, is saying that this is only really happening when a person's been charged. And he basically was calling on Police Scotland to have a kind of take-all policy that if you've got somebody come in a suspect to the custody area, to the cells, you've got to fingerprint them, you've got to photograph them. Whereas what he's saying was happening, it was only after they've been charged. Now, we looked a bit more into this. I spoke to a former police officer who worked in custody, and his suggestion was that particularly in Scotland, just the workloads on custody staff are such, there might not always be the chance to take fingerprints. And also a lot of the time you're dealing with people with mental health issues and what have you that wouldn't normally require to be photographed or fingerprinted. But certainly the Biometrics Commissioners call on Police Scotland to fingerprint more people, to photograph more suspects as they come in. And he was saying that in his report last week that, you know, the police could be losing a lot of kind of valuable information and data by not doing this kind of automatic kind of fingerprint process. And he pointed to in England and Wales where they do fingerprint and photograph everybody as soon as they come into the police station after they've been arrested. And he also pointed out the fact that officers there have got maybe the technology slightly better. They can access when they're out on the streets, you know, a person's details on their smartphone and to find out if they're in the system. So the argument was that the police are losing a lot of data because of this. Police Scotland's response was that it's not always possible to fingerprint people if they get taken to hospital or as they use the word, non-compliant. But they said they'd be taking the information from the Biometrics Commission on board, and they would be looking to improve their procedures in this respect. So it's only one worth keeping an eye on.
Elsewhere, new figures showed that the police are using more force when dealing with suspects, including handcuffs, restraints and pepper sprays. This increase appears to be linked with the rising gangland violence this year in Edinburgh and Glasgow. What is the latest on that?
Yeah, again, another interesting one, that the police are now required anytime they use physical force or restraint to fill out a form and detail what sort of restraint was used. So every time they use handcuffs, for example, as a restraining method, they've got to record that. They use spit hoods, pepper sprays, tasers, any physical restraints that could be holding somebody or holding them to the ground, or even using things like leg restraints and what have you. So basically the figures the latest figures are for the first 6 months of the last financial year. So that was April to September 2025. And there was a comparison with the same figures for 2024, and it showed an 11% increase in the use of force. Now, the interesting thing about that was that corresponds with the same period that we saw Operation Portalege, which was a police operation against organised crime, which we've talked about a lot and written a lot in the Daily Record, talked about Criminal Record podcast. This is outbreak of violence in Edinburgh and Glasgow areas where members of the Daniel crime family and their associates have been targeted and properties set on fire and individuals attacked with machetes and what have you. And it's said that this violence is part of a kind of wider longer term or linked to a wider longer term feud between the Lyons and Daniel crime families, with new figures coming onto the scene. We've already seen a lot of people sentenced to quite lengthy prison terms for the various fire bombings and fire attacks and machete attacks. So it may well be that this increase in the use of force will be related to these fairly major police investigations and raids on individuals that they've linked into this violence. For example, just quite interesting, one of the biggest rises was in physical restraint. So there was, in 2024, there was 7,930 instances of physical restraint be used. That rose last year to 9,729, and a similar increase with the use of pepper sprays, handcuffs and spit hoods. We spoke to the Scottish Police Federation, as to their views, and their opinion is that one of the other reasons, or one of the main reasons, is just basically increase in assaults on police officers. That officers are increasingly come under attack from members of the public or suspects that they arrest, and they need to take these measures, particularly use of pepper spray, spit hoods, to defend themselves. And we know the Federation has called, and they are calling, for every officer to be trained in the use of taser, so that they can take it out into the street when they're on patrol or on duty. So again, that's an interesting one to keep an eye on.
And shifting gears a bit, Limbs and the Loch killer William Beggs is back in the spotlight after one of his victims, Brian McQuillan, was told he would not be notified if he ever paroled or set free, as it's now normal for victims of crime. He was told that the most recent victims and their families can be notified. What was Mr. McQuillan's reaction to this?
This is quite an unusual case, really. Readers will be familiar with the William Beggs case. Beggs was sentenced to life imprisonment in 2001 at the High Court in Edinburgh for the murder of 18-year-old supermarket worker Barry Wallace, who he met and took back to his flat in Kilmarnock, murdered him and dismembered his body and dumped the various parts in Loch Lomond. A part was found on the beach, for which he was sentenced to life imprisonment. And it was told he must serve 20 years before he can be considered for parole. That that period, the punishment part of the sentence has now expired. So Beggs has been eligible for parole for a number of years now, probably the last 4 or 5 years. That 20 years has expired since 2001 when he was sentenced. And Brian McQuillan was a previous victim of William Beggs. He'd met Beggs in Glasgow in 1991. Beggs had advised him back to his flat in Kilmarnock. Brian had woken up, having fallen unconscious or fallen asleep, and found Beggs tried to attack him with a razor. He managed to escape by jumping out a window, and he was found by passers-by. And Beggs was later that year was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. Now, Brian last year wrote to the parole board opposing any release by Beggs. It's entitled to do, the parole board's entitled to consider that, but not act on it. But he also contacted the Crown Office and Prison Service, who run a VNS, Victim Notification Scheme, and asked that should William Beggs ever be released on parole or on licence, that he should be told as a former victim. And now Brian was in a similar situation when Beggs was released from his earlier sentence for the attack on him. They didn't have the victim notification scheme then, and Brian has claimed that he actually bumped into Beggs where he was out driving. He saw him in another car and had a couple of chance encounters after that. And he felt that he should have been told then, albeit they didn't have the scheme. So now, when he's read and heard about various court actions by Beggs towards getting parole, or with a view to getting parole, he's asked that should Beggs ever be released, that he's told about it. Now, he applied last July, and was refused, told he wasn't eligible. He then made an appeal to that and was told last month that he still wasn't eligible. It appears that according to the Victim Notification Scheme rules, the only people who can be notified under the scheme is that the perpetrator's last victim or the family of the last victim, would obviously be Barry Wallace's family, quite rightly so. But Brian is kind of campaigning on this, and he believes that when somebody's in prison for and has been sentenced to different offences, that all these victims should be notified, especially if there's similar offences. A classic example might be somebody sent to prison for domestic abuse, where he's committed other offences in the past for which he's been convicted. That everybody, all the previous victims, should be told. And he says that normally would be that if Beggs was ever convicted of other offences while in prison, then the parents of Barry Wallace might no longer be eligible either. So again, that's a one to watch, and there could be a development there. I think we took the view in the record there was a bit of necessary red tape, and hopefully that the Crown Office and Prison Service might use this case to review the policy. Definitely.
The Daily Record has also reported on 43 people being arrested as part of a County Lines drug dealing crackdown. We hear a lot about County Lines criminality. Can you explain what that is and the significance of the latest police operation?
Yeah, County Lines is something that's it's a relatively new phenomenon, but the police have been looking at probably for the last 5 or 6 years. Now, we know about organised crime in the big cities, and it's the drug distribution networks that exist, and people, particularly with cocaine. But what we're seeing now is a lot of organised crime groups. They're moving into smaller towns, and setting up drug dealing operations there. But what they do is they'll take over somebody's house. So that person, usually quite a vulnerable person, adult, maybe a drug addict, they take over that person's house and then use that as a base for a drug distribution network. Now, the police did an operation last week in Inverness, part of a wider sort of national Silent Ridge operation in tandem with other forces across the UK. And the intelligence was that there was gangs from Liverpool, London, and obviously the sort of Glasgow area had moved into Inverness and set up these kind of County Lines distribution networks using the kind of vulnerable people in their homes. So this crackdown, it was a kind of over several weeks, recovered £900,000 worth of drugs, and that's just in a relatively small town city, including ketamine, crack cocaine, and cocaine. But what was interesting also was that they found 38 people who had come under the control of these organised crime groups through the County Lines, including 9 children who were effectively set free. So almost it was a form, I would say quite slavery, but these 39 individuals, including 9 children, were under the control of these crime groups, and they were kind of liberated, set free. And the police also recovered 30-odd thousand pounds worth of cash in the various properties. So that's maybe a side of organised crime we don't see, that where vulnerable people are taken advantage of and exploited.
And yesterday, the Record also reported that 4 out of 10 police offices have closed since the formation of Police Scotland. Is this something the public should be worried about, and what is the implication for the fight against crime?
Yeah, since Police Scotland was formed in 2013, something like we reported the fact that over 202 police stations have closed, that leaving about 337. And so a lot people will be familiar with a lot of the police stations that in your local area no longer exist. They're being closed down. Now, the Police Scotland say this is because they're no longer needed. The days of people turning up with their police station to report a crime or require assistance, it's no longer the demand for it. That people are happier to contact the police through their 101 service, obviously 999 if it's an emergency, but through 101 or through the sort of online email portals. I'm not convinced about that. I think if you take it away, it's like the banks, people need them, but we're taking them away. We've not really kind of analysed properly the demand for it. I still think there's a demand, and a lot of the politician parties think there's still a demand for police stations in the local communities. Another suggestion is that a lot of these police stations have fallen into disrepair anyway. It's very expensive to keep them open, so it makes more sense to sell them off or dispose of them. Now, in some cases, that would be just literally selling off the building. We've seen a lot of police stations converted into housing, for example. The police stations, in other cases, have just relinquished the lease, so that returns to its original owner. And in some cases, lots of the buildings have just been demolished. For example, Ayr Police Office, that's in the process of being demolished, as is one in Rutherglen, both previously fairly major police offices function in the local community. So we're seeing that. We spoke to the Police Federation about it. They would like to see more police officers, not less. They say that you need the contact in the community, getting to know the public. We talk about, again, often about the fight against organised crime. One of the interesting things was a lot of the police stations that have closed down or been in areas where historically there's been a lot of crime. For example, classic Saracen Police Office in Postle Park, which covers Postle Park and Milton, which had been the scene of this long-running feud between the Lions and Daniels, which we've talked about. So that's in an area that historically has been high crime. There's been a lot of organised crime activity. Also areas like the Castle Milk, the south side of Glasgow, the Gorbals, even areas like Bishop Briggs, what have you, Portobello in Edinburgh, a lot of rural police offices like in the Braemar area in south of Scotland have closed down. So the feeling is that the political parties we spoke to oppose this. So they think that there should be more places in the community, whether you call them police stations or whether it's cops operating out of schools or shopping centres. So again, it's a controversial issue. As I say, we've lost almost 40% of police stations since Police Scotland was set up. Wouldn't be surprised if there's more to follow.
Mm. A breaking news story this morning was a robbery in Livingston. Can you talk us through what happened there?
Yeah, this is an unusual one. It's a ram raid. I mean, ram raids we thought they were a bit of a thing of the past, but this is really one with a difference. It was a ram raid in the Armandale shopping centre in Livingston. The earliest hours this morning, Police Scotland have just released details in the last hour or so. Shortly after midnight, 2 cars, a Nissan and an Audi, pull up outside the shopping centre. The occupants tried to get access to a kind of clothing shop where there's designer clothes by ramming the cars through the window, break into the premises. But for some reason they can't get what they're looking for, so they decide to ram the main entrance of the shopping centre using the Audi and the Nissan car. In doing so, they crash through the sort of glass doors and also damage bollards. They then enter this same shop where they steal a lot of kind of designer clothing. They stick the designer clothing in the Audi. For some reason or other, they set the Nissan car on fire. So we've got this situation where the Nissan car's on fire outside a shopping centre. We've had an attempt to break into the shop through the shop window. It's been damaged. And then the ram raided the door itself through the bollards to get access into the main building. The 4 masked robbers, if we call them that, they all jump in the Audi, which speeds off. They dump that a short distance away and apparently leave most of the clothing or a large percent of the clothing are just stolen in the car. So it seems that on the one surface it's been a reasonably well organised, quite deliberate, maybe targeted raid. The other end, it's just ended in chaos, and they don't appear to have gained anything, criminality-wise. Have left the items have stolen in the getaway car. So the police are investigating, put a detective inspector in charge, taking it seriously because we've had this break-in, we've had the fire, which could have been caused more damage and been potentially more dangerous. So again, we'll keep an eye on this one, and we'll give you all updates as they come along.
Definitely. Well, thank you, Norman, for joining us, and
thank you, Billy.
Thanks to the audience for tuning in to Criminal Record. If you have any questions for the team, you can email reporters@dailyrecord.co.uk with the subject line Criminal Record. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, you can subscribe to listen to this podcast on Spotify or Apple by searching for Criminal Record, or you can watch it week to week on our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.